the NBA draft. We are getting towards the end of looking through our prospects. Today we've got a couple of big ones, two guys who might go in the top 5, plus one of the more random players, but our guest wanted to talk about him. It's all coming up. Michael Bolton, how random are you?
Thanks, Josh. It's Michael Bolton here, and it's time for another episode of the Locked On Fantasy Basketball Podcast. Let's get to it.
Let's get to it, indeed.
You are Locked On Fantasy Basketball, your daily fantasy basketball podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Fantasy Basketball Podcast, brought to you by Basketball Monster. My name is Josh Lloyd, and like Jay-Z Zaha, I am also keeping my name in the 2024 NBA Draft. I'm also the lead fantasy analyst at basketballmonster.com, and you can find me on Twitter as always at redrock_bball, on TikTok at redrock_bball, and on Instagram at LockedOnFantasyBasketball. This episode is brought to you by PrizePicks, the easiest and the most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA. Use the code all lowercase LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Thank you also for making Locked On Fantasy Basketball your first listen every day. We are free. We are available on all platforms. We're here, like I said, talking NBA draft. We're dipping our quill back in the no ceilings fountain. Is that a weird analogy? A little bit. We might as well just bring him in right now. All right, here he is back on the show. Maxwell Baumbach is here. Maxwell, welcome back to the show.
It's great to be back. I'm super excited. Love talking about these prospects with you. It's so fun to get different opinions around this time of year too. So always love to pick your brain and hear what you think about these guys as well.
Yeah, so you're about the 5th guy I think we've had on from No Ceilings, but you guys don't have the same opinion on these prospects. So
no.
Corey's been on, both the Tylers have been on, Steven's been on, you're on. You're going to have a whole bunch of different ideas and thoughts around all of these players, and that's what we're going to get into. And we've got a couple of really high-level guys, like two guys who conceivably, I guess, could go in the top 5 that we're going to cover here, plus some other deeper type prospects. We'll just get straight in and talk about the first guy that we're going to get to, and it is a player who, his stock is, like everyone in this draft, a little bit all over the map. We're going to Matas Buzelis, who played for the G League Ignite, and I don't know. Like, he's 19. He's got the size, right? He's 6'11". He's a forward. We averaged 19 and 9 per 40 minutes in the G League with 2.6 blocks, which you go, okay, wow, that's eye-opening. Like, is he that player? Like, I don't know. Like, 21 usage at the G League's pretty strong, but then, like, didn't get to the line, didn't really take that many threes. His efficiency was down. Like, what is he? Is he a perimeter guy that needs the ball and dribble drive? Does he shoot? Is he a weak side? What the hell is this guy?
Yeah, I think the idea of him is that he's like a good weak side rim protector who can make some connective passes, can guard the ball pretty well, has a little bit of self-creation, and then you have to hope that the shot comes around. And the shooting indicators aren't great, but I think if you look at him compared to how a guy like PJ Washington shot as a freshman at Kentucky. Now, he came out after his sophomore year, but I think that's ideally the hope, is that you're getting a guy who can guard a few positions, protect the rim from the weak side, knock down shots, and have a little bit more scoring than just your traditional forward prospect. He can do a little bit of interior, do a little bit of mid-range, and then ideally you're hoping that shot gets there also.
How much did the Ignite infrastructure with the type of players that were around, like Tyler Smith sort of occupying a similar spot on the court, Ron Holland with a similar spot on the court, like all of these guys sort of like, hey, they're sort of forwards-ish players who do need the ball a little bit. Like, you're not saying that made him a bad shooter or anything, but like the game, we knew this heading into the season ago, this was weird. How are these guys all going to coexist? How much of that do you take into it and go, well, this situation was actually like not good at all, and NBA situation is going to be way better almost wherever he goes?
Yeah, I think where it hurt him was in terms of where he is efficiency-wise. Not the best self-creator, especially as a pull-up shooter beyond the arc, just like from a physical strength standpoint. That's kind of where I pinpoint that issue to be, and he has continued to fill out his frame, so you hope that does come along. The idea of Matas Buzelis preseason, if you look at the way a lot of people talked about him, was almost as like a point forward type.
Yeah.
And even if you were comparing him to a guy like Gordon Hayward, that was almost seen as like, well, he's actually more of a point forward. Like Hedo Turkoglu was like the kind of guy that you would hear him compared to at times. Like, he's not that. He's very clearly not that. So I think from a pure like shot creation standpoint, he was burdened with more than he should have been. Doesn't have a great pull-up range from like beyond the arc. Like if he's in that mid-range area, it's fine. But downhill early in the year, he struggled a little bit with physicality, had a hard time getting to his spots. And I think it just took him a while to figure out like how to impact the game in a variety of ways. Like if you look at his shot blocking, that was the big thing that jumped up later in the year, but also his rebounding. He became a much better rebounder as the year came along. And I think he kind of figured out like, what do I look like in a winning role when I'm this, as opposed to this idea of what I was supposed to be. So I think his efficiency is definitely where you see it the most. But as the year went on, he was figuring out other ways to kind of impact the game and make up for that. And I think his physicality, particularly on defense, came along quite a bit later in the year. He was walling guys off, containing bigger forwards, and doing the things you would hope to see him do at the next level more often.
Now, I don't think anyone would tell you that they think these guys are the same necessarily. But when I put a lot of his rate statistics and strong sort of indicators from G League numbers and compared them in the Batovic College database, the name that came out as pretty similar there was Jarris Walker, a guy that had some struggles with his shot, but put up big defensive numbers, rebounded well, a similar height, a similar age coming out as well. Again, most people no one thinks that about Jarris Walker. No one thinks that Matas is the type of defender that Walker was coming up, but all the numbers sort of line up similarly. Again, it's G League versus college, but what I've been calling it is the shape. Like the shape lines up.
Yeah, I think there's something to that. I think Matas, he's been very underrated as a defender. I think a lot of people kind of tuned out of the G League as the season went along, especially as Ron Holland was like out for the year. And that's when he really made that leap defensively. So I do think defensively, he is a little bit closer to Jarris Walker than people realize. I think what he has on his side is that he's a little bit bouncier and a little bit more fluid than Jarris. Like Jarris has some handle stuff, but it's more like power based, where Matas has a little bit more silkiness to how he operates with the ball. I think from a pure like statistical standpoint, it's there, but their means of how they go about doing it is different. And I think that would lead me to believe that Matas has a little bit more upside because he's got a little bit more of that shake, a little bit more of that wiggle in a functional sort of free moving way than Jarris does, where like a lot of these more power based guys that aren't like outlier dominant don't tend to hit like the highest end outcomes.
He's taller than Jarris as well, I'm pretty sure, isn't Jarris?
Yeah,
like
he's 6'10".
And when you watch Jarris on the court, he looks like he's on the 6'9" playing up sort of style, whereas Matas just looks big, like he looks bigger than that sort of thing. And I guess also part of that is the width as well. And Walker's a lot broader, and Buzelis is not quite as broad, and he looks taller and skinnier and shorter and stocky, all that sort of stuff. But yeah, I think it's just interesting because again, those numbers stand out. The defensive numbers, you go, what the hell is this? Like, I didn't think that this was who this guy was, but they're there.
I think it is.
And maybe we just like I said, the default is, and I put on the casual Josh hat and look at all this and go, oh, look at this tall guy, white guy, shooter. That's what he does. Yeah, he shoots from the perimeter, but no, like he's not really. Like that's the big problem is he doesn't do that. He does these other things, but he doesn't do the shooting, and maybe that comes, maybe it doesn't. And he's an interesting prospect. How important do you think fit is for Buzelis in terms of where he gets drafted? Like if he is put into a position where there isn't shooting next to him, is that going to create more problems for him? Is it got to be like one of those ones that can be like, oh, this is a real disaster? Or he's in the right spot and you go, man, what a pick. How did everyone miss on it? Is he like one of the guys at the top of that list in terms of context is really key? Because that's sort of how it feels to me.
I think he's a little bit less fit dependent
than
people might realize, just because I think with his size, like fluidity and bounce, there's going to be ways to utilize him. I think especially as he keeps getting stronger, like I think he's actually going to be able to do some ball handling stuff, not like as a primary or anything. But I do think that there's going to be different ways that you can utilize him as like a screener, a cutter, a downhill roller almost. You could short roll him. He's confident in the shot at the very least. So I think that's something that he'll at least take them. I think he's going to look a little bit like what Denny Avdia looked like his first couple of years.
Yep.
Where it's like, it's definitely not good. Like, it's not going to be good if the shot isn't going in. But I think that there's a real path to functionality, and he's never going to be the guy in the court that you're like, he's the reason we're getting killed right now. Like, I think just based on being that size, that athletic, the defense, the rebounding, like he's not going to be the reason that everything's really bad.
He's very interesting as a player. At the moment, well, initially when I had it 2 weeks ago and I did my first sort of go through of this, I had him at number 5. But look, I just don't know. Like, I'm just not really sure. Outside of one, which I'm relatively set on, the next 10 guys, switch them around. Really,
I've never been more fluid with that range this late in the year than I have been this year. So you are not alone.
If this was a fantasy draft situation, you go, I mean, I want to pick more towards the end of that group because it's in a snake draft, and I get a second chance in the next round that starts. But that's not really how the NBA draft works. Is you don't have the snake draft where if you pick at like 10 or 12, you get an earlier pick in the second round. It doesn't work that way, unfortunately. So that logic doesn't really fit in this one. We're going to get back and talk about another guy who could sneak into the top 5 just in a moment. But today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. Prize Picks is America's #1 fantasy sports app with more than 3 million members. It is also the easiest and the most exciting way to get in on the action while you watch your favorite sports and favorite players. You pick between 2 to 6 individual player stat projections. They've got the projections up there. You look at them and you go, I go more on this or I go less on this, and that's it. Bang it in. And at the moment, you can actually go 100 times your money with as little as 4 correct picks. $10 turns into $1,000 if you hit those correct ones, whether it's NBA playoffs, NHL playoffs, the baseball season is up and running. You're gonna, I don't know if they've got it. Maybe they've got College World Series in there as well. They're always going to be in on the PGA, but of course, disc golf is the one that we all want to pay attention to there over at Prize Picks. So go and download the app. Use the code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100 dues. Download the app. Use the code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks. Pick more, pick less. It is that easy. All right, let's get into the next guy. I'm as with every one of these guys, Maxwell, I am conflicted, and I'll tell you why I'm conflicted about Reed Sheppard is because I look at Reed Sheppard and go, Kentucky guards, I'm always going to give them the benefit of the doubt. I'm always going to give them the bump. We'll see how long that lasts now that Calipari's gone, but I'm going to give them the bump. And I go, yeah, but do I want a 6'1" guard? Like that's like. Do I want that? Probably not. Like, I don't know. I know he's like 6'3" in shoes. He's 6'1.5" without shoes. And I'll tell you what, I'm also not going to buy that anyone is going to be a 53% three-point shooter in the NBA. It's just not going to happen. So, like, we can look at those numbers and they're awesome. Like, that three-point shooting number is great. The three-point attempt rate is great. You only average 16 points per 40 minutes, and that's really low. 3.2 steals is out of control. Like, there are so many things I go, wow, that's great. Then it's like the meme of that girl drinking kombucha. Like, that's what I feel like when I'm looking at all this Reed Sheppard stuff. And maybe he's the best shooter in the draft, but also maybe he isn't. The amount of times we heard last season, Grady Dick, he's definitely the best shooter in the draft. He shot 12% for about 3 months to start the year. And that idea of the best shooter in the draft is always just so fluid, and very rarely is the guy with the best shooting percentage out of college becomes that guy. And in fact, when you look at Tankathon, they've got this little formula of projected three-point percentage. It's like NBA percentage, and they base it on volume and touch and free throw rate and free throw percentage. He comes out at like 39%. That's not 40. That's not 41. That's not 43. So Reed Sheppard, it's very easy to go, we love shooting. He's going to be able to do it. He hits everything. So like that's the player we want. I'm not there. He's too small, and I don't really. I think he's too small. I worry about NBA length bothering that shot, and I'm just going to come in with a baseline and go, okay, you're a 40% three-point shooter if it all works, and you are not this outlier, the best shooter ever prospect. How do you, I guess, not go against that, but maybe you do want to go against it? Like, what's the
I think there's a chance it's real. Yeah, I think there's a chance it's real. Like, just from a pure three-point field goal percentage standpoint, he was outlier great. He graded out exceptionally well on catch and shoots and pull-up threes. So we know that there's a real level of dynamism to it. We've seen him do it from the NBA line. I completely understand concerns about the size, and I understand concerns about the volume as well. But I also think it's important to note that he was never going to get a crazy level of attempts just because he wasn't going to take that many shots per 100 possessions, given sort of the egalitarian nature of Kentucky's offense and how many prospects they had on their team. But I do think that in a class with so many guys that do have statistical questions, there's some real merit to leaning into a guy who was statistically stellar, at least as a three-point shooter. And then on the defensive end, like, I completely understand the concerns about his length. I don't love how he stays in front of the ball. I think he can have attentiveness issues off of it at times as well. Not super quick with this defensive first step, but really great in terms of getting up off the floor, much better up off the floor than side to side. Really good with his hands and just mirrors movements with his hands exceptionally well. Outstanding steal and block rates. Like, I think at worst, we're looking at a guard who can knock down threes, make great decisions, because some of the passing flashes, too, I thought were really impressive. I think he has a pretty advanced feel for the game in terms of the types of passes that he's able to make. I just see a guy who can really shoot the ball, make plays defensively, and be that stabilizing force offensively. He was a good rebounder, too, which is generally a pretty good indicator with smaller guards as to whether or not they're going to make it. I understand concerns about the length. I understand concerns about the lateral athleticism. But I think at a certain point, like, statistically, he just becomes very difficult to bet against, and I think his floor is very safe.
I agree with that. Like, it sounds like I hate him and I wouldn't draft him in the top 10. That's not true. I had him at number 6, right? But I didn't have him as the first guard going off the board. I didn't have him as the first Kentucky guard going off the board. I just think that what Dillingham can do is probably a little bit more interesting to me from an NBA perspective. And these things you talk about, that steal rate is huge, and that's a huge indicator of at least competence or if not success at the NBA level. The rebounding is good. The passing is good. The statistical comps, the two guys that come out, one of them is Tyrese Halliburton, one of them is Lonzo Ball. And you go, okay, yeah, well, like that's great. Like, they're lower usage players, but Halliburton's upped it. Still not a super high usage player, but like, they're great players. Then unfortunately, we go to Davion Mitchell and Corey Thomas after that, and I go, okay.
and height wise, he's closer to two of those guys than he is the other two. Unfortunately,
that's where some of the problems start to come in. Shane Larkin, Patrick McCaw, and you go, yeah. All right, so we've got the range of outcomes there. But like, I think when there are certain mock drafts or boards, and I don't know where you've got him, but they'll have him at like 3. Like, I don't think that I want to do that. But yeah, for me, he's a guy that I would take late lottery in a lot of drafts. But in this one, that pushes him up higher to me. And I do think he'll be a good shooter, but I think expecting like to be the consistent 46% Luke Kennard guy every year with that size, and that's, I think, where some of the problems come in for me in translating that across.
I think that's understandable. I think, to me, because so many of the prospects at the top of the board have pretty severe statistical flaws, like, I'm just at a point where I want to take the one guy who like did actually show me that he could perform at a high level. And that's where Reed Sheppard comes in. Like, I've got him top 3 on my board right now, just because I think between the playmaking,
many do.
Stabilizing force, the shooting, the decision-making, like, I think that he's just got a chance to be to hit a much higher ceiling than a lot of these guys. And I think he may actually have a more realistic path to it, even if the floor might not be as sexy, or, he might not be the big wing with size and athleticism. Like, I get that, but I think he's got a real good chance to reach a nice outcome.
What do you make of the insane vertical at the combine?
I like it. I do think he sandbagged it a little bit because his standing reach was like improbably short. Like, he was 6'2", and then his standing reach was like 6'5". And it's like, you wait a minute, like, you don't have 3-inch long arms. Like, he had like a relatively normal vertical for his height, and then a ridiculously short standing reach. So but I do think he has real pop. Like, if you look at him in the open floor when he's got a runway, he can get up. Like, I do think he's a much quicker downhill and more explosive vertical athlete than people give him credit for.
Yeah, that's it. So it's not like the Pat Connaughton missed recording of the vertical. This is a deliberate manipulation by Reed Sheppard to get the numbers up there. Hey, you know what? If it works for him and he gets a higher draft slot and he gets more money out of it, good for him for be able to get through that sort of assist. But he's obviously a really intriguing player with very high end outcomes. If it works, there are just some things that NBA players have just found it hard to overcome. Like, it's just hard to find that success. But like you said, we aren't dealing with a bunch of elite prospects who don't have those flaws ahead of him. So maybe this works. Maybe this outlier skill, outlier skill defensively, passing lanes, all that sort of stuff. Like, all that looks really good compared to everyone else. Maybe that's enough. And maybe, like I say, I don't hate him. I hate him at 6, and I don't know if I'll have him there, but that's where I had him. And I think that is, he's just one of those really intriguing guys where people can have some very strong takes either way. And in this draft, you can have the strong take, but like, who knows? Like, there's so much of that goes on here where I'm just like, I'm not really sure the way that it's going to pan out. But he is interesting. I don't dislike him. Kentucky guard bump is there. Who do you like? If we compare and contrast with Kentucky guard, let's talk Rob Dillingham. Like, you've got Reed ahead of Rob. Is it a big difference to you?
No, I think with Reed, where I feel a little bit better is the defense and the physicality. Like, I feel like Rob's defense is
bad,
really messy, really messy. And I just think like the size and like we look at how the playoffs have been officiated and just the level of contact that's becoming acceptable and the importance of just like having some meat on your bones. Teams are going to hunt these mismatches, and just having that extra 25 pounds that Reed has over Rob goes a long way.
I completely understand that part of it. Now we've got an older prospect we're going to get to right now, a guy that he was in the draft process. I feel like for the last 10 years, he has transferred schools a couple of times. We are talking, or a couple of times, at least one time. Kevin McCullar, who was at Kansas this year, was at Texas Tech.
Yeah, he was Kansas this year, Texas Tech prior to that.
Yeah, Texas Tech prior. He's old, like so many of these wings. Like every 6'7" guy seems to be 22 or 23 that's in this draft, and he's another one of those. I guess he's a wing. He's probably more of a guard, but he's an interesting sort of a player. But 21-7 with almost 4.7 assists per 40 minutes, 6'6", 23 years of age, 34 minutes, 28 usage, solid 3-point rate, solid free throw rate, good free throw numbers. All of these numbers, they look like, yeah, that's really, really solid here, Kevin McCullar. They're really good. But let's start off comparing him with an easy sort of prospect, a guy that was an older player for Kansas last season, Jalen Wilson, who ended up going in the second round and was actually really solid as an NBA rotation guy when he got in. McCullar does all this stuff. He's this older prospect. All this stuff looks good. Is there a path for him being, say, the guy or a usage type player in the NBA, or has he got to do something different the way that Wilson had to sort of change his game as well?
Yeah, I see him being a secondary guy, and I think that's why I like him more than Jalen Wilson, is that I think when he slides back into that secondary role, he can really show out on the defensive end, like he did during his last 2 seasons at Texas Tech and even the season prior at Kansas. If you just look at those seasons, his steal and block rate was outrageous. He was just one of those kind of fly all over the place, ground coverage, wing, forward type guys who could really read passing lanes exceptionally well, make help plays at the rim, showed a motor in transition. He's diving on the floor all the time, using his strength to wall guys off, very good with his hands guarding the ball, like just a really well-rounded multi-positional defender. I think that's the sales pitch, and I think that the knock on McCullar has always been his shooting, but if you look at him compared to other forwards in their pre-draft seasons, from a volume and efficiency standpoint, particularly off the catch, he's actually in a really solid place. The usage is kind of what killed him. Like he had to take a lot of pull-up shots on a Kansas team, and this guy is not a pull-up shooter. But I think if you can simplify the role in the NBA where he's catching and shooting or attacking downhill and making these passing reads, and he had that great assist to turnover ratio this past year, and then locking in on defense and making a ton of plays, he's going to carve out a long-term career.
Yeah, the shooting is the interesting thing because, let's be honest, if you just look at the raw numbers, they're terrible. Like, they're not good at all. He shot 30.9% over his career. And this guy enrolled in college before the Raptors won the title. Like, he's
took a red shirt. A lot of people don't know.
He redshirted and then played 5 years after that. Like, that is like an insane amount of time in college. Like, that's why he's been around forever. And I would have hoped for a little bit more, say, growth in the last 2 seasons. Like there was some growth there, but I wouldn't say that he's like, we didn't get this gigantic improvement in his shooting. It did improve, but we saw a huge usage bump. But that to me is also a little bit of a red flag. Like went from 8 shots per game, 8 shots per game, 8 shots per game. Now that I'm 23 years old, it's 13.5. And that is like, okay, so now you're running all this stuff. But you're right, the defensive stuff is that part of it. And it's, I'm always going to look at these older guys, high usage, doing this stuff and go, you're not going to do it in the NBA. What else can you do? And he has got the other things there, which are, I guess, parts to fall back on. And I think the point that you make regarding the pull-up shooting versus catch and shoot, like that will enable him possibly to actually have a respectable 3-point number, because he's not ever going to do that in the NBA, I'm guessing.
Yeah, and like there was some decent movement stuff in there. Like his transition numbers last year were actually pretty solid. They had a couple plays where like they ran him off of flare screens and things like that, where like there is like a baseline level of movement to him where like he's not going to be a guy who can only who can only shoot if his feet are like completely planted in concrete. Like he's a little bit more than that. 6 for 13 on transition, which isn't a high number, and then like 7 for 19 off screens. So like there's a little bit more dynamism to him than like just still. No shots look fine and they look confident.
Now, that's 3 guys that most people would have heard of. Now, we've got to get to this next player that is going to be really interesting for us to talk about. So I, like everybody, Maxwell, I am a fan of Moorhead. I'm not sure that I'm as big of a fan of Moorhead State as you are, because you sent me a message today saying, hey, there's a guy that I want to talk about, because there was someone we were going to talk about who had to pull out. I can't remember who it was. They just get immediately taken out of my mind that he withdrew from the draft. And you're like, let's talk about Riley Minix. And I saw this at like 5:30 a.m. or whatever it was this morning. I go, has Maxwell like sent me one of his like people that he subscribes to on OnlyFans? Who is Riley Minix? What am I looking at here? What are you talking? And I almost replied to you, go, I'm not really sure of them, because I didn't even know what you were talking about. I was like, is this a real person? What is going on? But here we are. We're talking Riley Minix, 23-year-old, 6'7". Oh, what a shock! A 23-year-old, 6'7" forward. Not many of those in this draft. He averaged insane numbers though. Like, these numbers are crazy. 26 and 12 per 40, 1.6 steals, 1.2 blocks. Like 60 effective field goal, hits his shots from the line. He's not just only a three-point shooter. Like, he's not like he's taking 60% of his shots from out there. They're outrageous numbers. They're outrageous rebounding numbers. What is he as a player? Is he a... Because immediately I go, you're 6'7", you're white, you're a forward with big rebounding numbers. That's what Dylan Windler did when he was coming out. Sure. So, but Windler had like the 40% three-point shooting. That's sort of how we projected him. Is that how you're projecting old mate Minix here?
So the dream is that he is something between, these are kind of different players, that he's something between Tumani Kamara and Sam Hauser.
Oh, wow. Okay. He is unbelievable on both ends. Just push that all together.
So Minix is 6'7". He's 230, 235. So he is real strong. And there's a lot of different ways that he can use that functional space on the court. He was actually a transfer up to Moorhead State. He played at an NAIA school prior to that, where he was a 40% career three-point shooter. He's one of these guys who can come off screens and shoot, and then set screens and shoot, similar to Sam Hauser. But he does sort of have this downhill gravity. He's not the shooter that Sam Hauser is. Like, Sam Hauser was over 40% every year playing at Virginia. Like, there's a difference in level of competition. But I do think he's a better shooter than the 35% this year would indicate. But he's also got this real nasty downhill driving game. He's got real bounce off one foot. If he has to do some more in-between stuff, show off his handle, take, a Dirk-style fadeaway, he can do that. Pretty heads-up passer. Was a little bit overburdened as a playmaker, but if you look at when he's making more 0.5 style decisions, he can do that. And then a very good defender within a team construct. So there's inside-out scoring, there's athleticism, there's physical strength, there's rebounding, there's defensive playmaking. He's like 80th on ESPN's board currently. I thought he was the best player in terms of like overall body of work that played at the Portsmouth Invitational. Somehow doesn't get a G League camp invite, which was mind-blowing to me. He was good at that event, measured well. I don't get why teams aren't higher on this guy. Like, to me, this is a guy that if I'm a winning team and I'm picking in the second round, I am like all over it. I'm all over this guy.
We've seen plenty of guys who do go undrafted, end up playing roles in the NBA. Like, we can talk Fred VanVleet, we can talk Vince Williams this season. Yeah, putting up those sort of numbers, who are just uber productive in college and just get overlooked for whatever reason, and then find themselves on a team, find themselves with a contract, and just through their play work into this larger role and become, you're actually a really good NBA player. I'm not saying that Riley's necessarily going to do that, but it's not an outrageous concept, because we've seen it happen many times. Now, a lot of the things you said there, now this is what when I hear these prospects, I know a bit about most guys. Riley, I didn't. I had to do some work this morning, right? And most of these guys, and then I hear little bits and pieces when I talk to the people who cover it more, little phrases, little sentences that they say that make me go, okay, let's probe that a little bit further. So you're talking about a guy who's 6'7", he's an older guy, he's a white guy, he shoots the ball really well, but then the guy's got a little bit more pop on his drives. He can get up and he can do this. And I hear people say the exact same thing about Dalton Connect. So what is Dalton Connect might go in the top 7, might go in, probably go in the lottery, and this guy may not get drafted. Like, obviously, level of competition is different. Connect transferred up as well, up to Tennessee this season. Minix transferred up to Moorhead State from a lower level, so there's a lot of similar pathways. So, what is the big separating factor between those two players?
I think Connect is a little bit more functionally athletic, especially and I think he's a much better ball handler. Like, I trust Connect to get to his shots a little bit more, where Minix isn't quite as fluid and as silky. He has to use his power a little bit more. So he was a little bit more mid-post than like I'm catching and driving every single time. He's a little bit more power-based, and I'm always a little bit leery of those guys as they scale up. just because it's not as seamless of a transition as if you can be faced up all the time. No, I do think Minix can face up enough, but I don't think that he's going to come in with that same level of comfortability, the same type of shake that Dalton Connect has. Not going to be as quick in a give and go setting. Doesn't get out in transition as well. I think he's just a little bit behind the curve in terms of athleticism and then how he gets to his shots as well.
It's always,
I don't think he's going to be as fast running around a screen as Dalton Connect is either.
Yeah, I'm not saying that he is Dalton Connect. It's just when we're talking about
it's a great question.
Little bits and pieces that there's a lot of similarities, and there could be such large discrepancies between players. When in the end, who knows how any of this stuff works? How the players can come from absolutely nowhere to be useful, impactful rotation players, and just getting an idea of the way that I like to look again. I said before, the shape of the player, the idea of the player, the sort of bits and pieces that we can relate to and where we can improve and what are the good things and the bad things and all that sort of stuff when looking at these prospects. We've got one more guy that comes from a school that people know of, and they've probably seen this guy play over the last couple of seasons. We're going to go to Harrison Ingram from UNC. He is another sort of wing-sized prospect. Again, people have seen a lot more of North Carolina State than they've seen of not North Carolina State, North Carolina, my apologies, than Morehead State. 21 and a half, 6'6", low usage, under 20% usage, 45% 3-point rate, attempt rate, free throws were terrible. Is he a 3-and-D wing that doesn't really have the shooting touch necessarily? What's his calling card apart from being a wing that played at North Carolina?
He's really fascinating to me. So he, prior to playing at North Carolina, had played at Stanford, where he was sort of overburdened as the lead playmaker for Stanford. He then transfers to North Carolina, where he plays a much more complementary role. He still has some athleticism issues. He's a little bit slow, not the highest leaper, but he's a really good rebounder. He did transform his shot, the volume and percentage both went up quite a bit this year. He's still bad at the free throw line, which is why I think he's much more of a second round guy. Career is 62.4%, but has real playmaking feel, has a level of strength that goes a long way defensively, as well as a high level of feel. So to me, Harrison Ingram is a guy that I just wonder, if the shot is real, are we sagging on him too much by having him as a late second round guy?
That's the thing.
Is he a guy that you could sort of plug and play and put on a majority of teams, and just all of the stuff that he does has value to it?
The indicators to me aren't particularly strong. So 39% from three this season, but like you said in Stanford, 32 and 31. Yes, he had a larger role, but at least some point get to average in terms of shooting, and you don't hit free throws, and your 2-point percentage isn't very high. So
no,
he was at 39 at Stanford one year and 41 the next year. He's at 43 overall field goal percentage this season, and they're all really low numbers. So and your low usage as well. There's just the shot is intriguing, the size is intriguing, the fact that he played at Stanford and more importantly at North Carolina is intriguing. The assist numbers are not terrible. The steal numbers this season are high. They were low at Stanford as well. That's interesting. So he's almost, again, the high pedigree guy or high pedigree school blue chip sort of school player a Cam Reddish was coming in. We go I guess he can do this, and then you go maybe he shoots, maybe he doesn't, and then where does it go? And Ingram is not the level of prospect of Reddish, but there's a lot of those similar things where there's always certain things that give people a benefit of the doubt, and Ingram is a name. I think he had his name in last year's draft and then withdrew and is back in here. And I'm just really skeptical. Low usage player with one season of good 3-point percentage. With everything else looking bad, I'm skeptical that that's going to work out. So if it doesn't work out, let's just say if it doesn't work out, Maxwell, if he's not a shooter, is there enough in the other parts of his game, like ball movement, cutting, defense, to keep him in a role?
I think he needs to shoot. I genuinely think he needs to shoot. And I think what you have to buy into is that you look at another big bodied high field guy like a Grant Williams, who didn't take a lot of threes in college, but he was granted, he was a much better free throw shooter. And you have to hope that he can look like what Grant looked like in Boston.
Yeah. Okay.
And then he can be this guy who he just shoots corner threes. He just uses physicality and he plays defense. I do think the floor is gnarly, to your point, because he is sort of a below the rim guy. So it's not oh, well, we're just going to run him on the baseline and throw lobs to him out of the dunker spot. It has to be there. but I think he's one of those like interesting bet prospects where if the shot is real and it does continue to progress, suddenly like you have a 6'8" guy who's comfortable doing a lot of different stuff. And if it's not there, everything kind of comes undone.
The statistical comparisons, there's no one who really sort of translates well. Like they have the similarity of scores and no one even hits an 80 on those numbers. So that's makes it interesting. But the number one name that comes up is Trevor Keels, who, we obviously just never
did not pan out.
Never
but he's got 4 inches and some real wingspan on Trevor Keels, which is like where it's interesting. Like I think teams are so much quicker to give up on guys that are sub 6'5". Where it's 6'8", true. I wonder if a team's a little bit more patient, lets them kind of rep out the shot in the G League a little bit longer.
Well, the second name on the list is actually Zach LaVine, who obviously had some big improvements coming through in the NBA. He wasn't that level of shooter coming out of college. We didn't really, sort of a bit upsidey prospect. Like, what do we do with this guy? And I would say LaVine almost hit all of his like best case scenario outcomes for a lot of that stuff.
Yeah.
But like that just gives you an idea between those sort of like the similarities are so low, but these are two like diametrically opposed players who are at the top of what Ingram does, and that's why it's so confounding. You're right. I think he does have to have that shot hit because the other stuff is just so like it's not remarkable enough that it's going to carry him through. Unlike a Kevin McCullar that we talked about earlier, where when he is, if he's not a usage player and he's not going to shoot, then like there's other stuff that he does that's going to be really, really good, and I don't know that happens here.
Yeah, I think we're on the same page with them.
Absolutely. And that, you know what, Maxwell, that brings us to the end of discussing these prospects. You can go back to digging through Riley Minix tape and, do whatever you need to do with that. It's been awesome to have you on and discussing through these prospects, some really good high-end players. One question, like we hear a lot about the strength or lack of in this class. And I've asked most people who have been on their idea of what that means, the interpretation of what that is, because you're always going to get the pushback of like, oh, but you can always find Rudy Gobert and Jokic was a second round pick. That'll always be the pushback. So I think most people are going to be in agreement, the people who cover this and dive deep into this. But what is how do you explain away that very easy, somewhat throwaway term of this is a weak draft?
I think that if you're picking at the top, there is not a lot of obvious star power. And I think the further down you go, you're going to like really kind of have to hope to get a lot of breaks to get it. But I think that there are a lot of interesting, valuable archetypes as far as the role players that are going to be available in this draft. And I think that we're not going to look back at this draft a few years down the road and be like, oh, well, there was only like 4 guys that stuck around the NBA. I think there are going to be players that stick around the NBA, but I think fit's going to matter. And I think it's going to be really important how teams approach development with these guys. But I think it's always important to keep a finger on the pulse of who the talent coming into the league is. And I think that there is a lot of talent coming into the league. We might just not be getting mega stars like we did in years past.
Yeah, there'll be some people who think the interpretation is that no one's going to play in the NBA, and that's just not true. Like there's going to be so many of these guys who have roles, and we kind of I've deliberately never asked this question of people, but some people would like to hear that question. I'm not going to ask it of you, but like, well, who's the guy who's the Giannis or the Jalen Brunson? If we knew who that guy was, then we'd pick him top 5 straight away. Like, that's the thing. Like all of those random late round players. I might give a slight exception to like a Jokic. I thought this is ridiculous he's fallen that far, but no one ever thought he'd become what he is. All these guys have to have exceptional, unpredictable levels of development that you just absolute outlier levels of development to get to where they are, and you just don't know if that's going to happen. It's like usually it doesn't. If you go look at every pick around those players, look at who was picked 42 after Jokic and 44 or 2 picks before him. They're probably completely useless and never did anything in the NBA. Maybe there's a Marcus Zagorowski in one of those players as well. But someone is going to pop most likely at some point, and you just have no way of being able to like judge that outlier logarithmic improvement across multiple areas, and that's where that becomes tough.
Yeah, it's going to be really tricky to pin down that guy, and I'm not sure he's there. But I do think that there's a lot of other talent that makes monitoring and studying this class worthwhile for any basketball fan.
What have you guys got going over at No Ceilings at the moment?
Yeah, so subscribe to NoCeilingsNBA.com. We've got daily written work on our Substack. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. We've got scouting breakdowns. Subscribe to our podcast feed as well on Apple or Spotify, wherever you listen. We got daily podcast content as well. Had a Kalel Ware article this week. I've got a Kevin McCullar article coming out next week where I go a little deeper into him as well. So make sure you check that out. But yeah, we're churning stuff out every single day until the draft. So tune in. We're doing a mock draft again soon, big board. So lock in. It's draft season.
Go check out all of Maxwell's stuff and all of the other guys over at No Ceilings. Maxwell, thank you again for coming on the show and discussing prospects with me.
No problem. Thanks so much for having me.
And that will bring us to the end of this show. And that is, well, no, we've still got one more. Because one more of the major sort of prospect shows is coming up in the next day or two. And then we move into maybe some overarching draft stuff, some big board stuff, some more mock drafts, and more of the team review shows as well. That is all going to be coming up in the coming weeks. And I hope you've enjoyed the prospects that we have covered at this point. And you get one more prospect focus show coming up in the next day or two as well. Guys, hit the old thumb, hit the old subscribe, double bang it, leave your comments, all of that stuff. Guys, we are done here. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. See ya.